If you agree that respect isn't about appearances, but about what someone has truly endured, like and subscribe, because this story deserves to be remembered. They thought she was just another worker, another young woman assigned grunt duty along the barricades, pushing gravel into neat piles under the afternoon sun. Dust clung to her boots, sweat carved thin lines down her temple, and to the soldiers passing by she looked like someone who didn't belong on their side of the wire. They muttered about her age, her size, her silence. 28, they whispered, hardly old enough to command respect, let alone carry the weight of combat. But what they didn't know was that every scoop of gravel, every measured movement of her shovel, was part of something larger. She wasn't passing time. She was watching, listening, memorizing. She had seen enough to know danger rarely announces itself with sirens. It creeps, quiet, waiting for arrogance to look away. And she knew this because she had lived it before, years earlier in the heat of deployment, building defenses under fire when the world around her was nothing but smoke and chaos. Now, standing by the barricade, they dismissed her as nothing more than a body filling space. What they didn't realize was that the speakers would soon crackle with a call that would rewrite everything they thought they knew. Zephyr, perimeter flanked. Move out. She had arrived early that morning, long before most of the younger soldiers dragged themselves into formation. She tied back her dark hair, slid her gloves on, and took her position along the half-finished line. The job was simple on paper. Shift rock, reinforce the footing, monitor the blind corner of the fence where the cameras had been unreliable. To her, though, it wasn't menial, it was muscle memory. She had built barricades overseas with her own hands, feeling the ground shake with each distant blast. She had carried beams through mud thick with fear, hammering defenses while watching shadows move where they shouldn't have. Every swing of her shovel that morning carried those memories. But to the cadets leaning against their trucks laughing, it looked like just sweat without purpose. The whispers started as they often do, laced with arrogance. Why's she out here? Doesn't she belong in logistics? One said, smirking. Another chuckled. She's here because she can't hack combat. Shovels don't bite back. They thought she couldn't hear them. She did. She always did. But instead of answering, she pressed the shovel deeper, gravel crunching beneath her boots, her eyes scanning the line of trees beyond the fence. Patience was her reply. Her file, if any of them had bothered to read it, told the story they mocked her for never speaking about. Enlisted at 19, combat engineer. 2 tours in her early 20s, one in the desert, one in mountains where the air itself fought against you. She specialized in rapid fortifications, building barriers under pressure so others could breathe behind them. She carried scars that didn't always show, the ringing in her ears from a blast at 24, the limp that came and went with the cold, the names written in her journal of those who hadn't made it back. She had earned every crease on her uniform, but youth was the disguise that kept others blind to it. 28 looked young to them, but 28 with a decade of service behind it felt older than most of them would ever understand. She leaned on the shovel for a moment, eyes narrowed at a weak point in the fencing. It was small, almost invisible, but she saw it, just like she always did. The earth had shifted slightly after last night's rain, loosening the tension. She marked it in her mind, knowing she'd circle back. Behind her, laughter rose again, this time louder. Lieutenant Harris, the one who never missed a chance to perform, walked by with his clipboard, smirking at the sight of her bent over gravel. Good work, Zephyr, he quipped, voice dripping with sarcasm. If we're ever invaded by dirt, you'll save us all. His words sparked more chuckles from the cadets behind him. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She had been through worse. Mockery in safe zones was nothing compared to the silence of friends missing at roll call. Still, Harris kept walking, never realizing the irony of dismissing the very person who would soon stand between him and chaos. The sun climbed higher, baking the gravel until heat shimmered above it. Zephyr kept moving, her body a rhythm of quiet labor, her mind tracing the perimeter like a map. She didn't crave recognition. She craved readiness, because readiness was the only thing that had ever stood between her and the void. It wasn't medals that had carried her home. It was vigilance, patience, the refusal to believe safety was permanent. And so she worked while others dismissed her. Then came the faint hum. She caught it before anyone else did. A low flicker in the comm system, a distortion that didn't belong. She paused, listening. Nothing came through, and so she turned back to her shovel. But inside, she knew what that static meant. Systems didn't falter without reason. She remembered nights overseas when a flicker meant insurgents crawling close under cover of dark. She tightened her grip on the shovel, eyes flicking to the fence again. Still, she said nothing. She let the silence build, because she knew the speakers would soon break it. And when they did, her name would echo across the base, startling those who thought they had her figured out. For Zephyr, it wouldn't be surprise. It would be the moment she had been ready for all along. The static that had teased her ears earlier in the morning returned, this time sharper, louder, no longer just background noise but a warning that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. And then it broke wide open as the speakers thundered across the base, the words crisp and commanding, slicing through laughter, chatter, and arrogance in an instant. Zephyr, perimeter flanked. Move out. For a moment the air itself seemed to freeze. Cadets who had been leaning lazily against trucks stiffened. Jokes died halfway off lips. And Lieutenant Harris, who had been smirking only minutes ago, turned toward the sound with a look of disbelief that almost bordered on fear, as if he had heard the name of someone he hadn't realized mattered. But Zephyr didn't hesitate. Her shovel hit the gravel with a dull metallic ring as she swung her gear onto her shoulder and was already moving before the others had even processed what they'd heard. Her boots cut across the packed dirt with a rhythm that carried urgency without panic. Her eyes locked on the tree line that had been tugging at her attention all morning, her mind already mapping out every blind spot, every delay, every consequence if she moved too slow. The cadets stared after her, some calling half-heartedly, "Wait, what's happening?" But she didn't look back. She had been called because command knew what most of them didn't, that she had trained for this, lived this, survived this more times than anyone could count, and she was the only one who could hold that perimeter together when the line buckled. She reached the failing comm relay near the fence corner in less than a minute, crouching low, stripping off her gloves with one sharp pull, and her fingers moved over the exposed wiring as though she had known all along this was where the breach would begin. Sparks snapped as she reset the manual override, and for a second the system fought her, static clawing at the radio feeds. Then the channels cleared with a surge, screens inside the control booth flickering back to life, watch posts relaying visual confirmations as the perimeter blinked alive. To everyone else it looked like luck, like she had somehow guessed where to go, but in her mind the map was already drawn. She had spent the entire morning marking weaknesses, the shift in soil, the dip in ground, the places where shadows pooled longer than they should, and while they laughed, she had prepared. Now she wasn't thinking about proving herself. She wasn't thinking about the sting of their mockery. She was thinking about the lessons seared into her bones overseas. The night when a mist static crackle cost 3 lives. The dawn when the earth shook from a hidden charge, and she crawled out of fire and dust to rebuild the barrier before the next wave came. The faces of the soldiers she had kept alive by reacting faster than fear. Every movement now came from those memories, not fury, not pride, but hard, lived survival. A cadet stumbled toward her, wide-eyed, asking what to do, panic clear in his voice, and Zephyr didn't waste breath on comfort or criticism. She pointed to the southeast blind spot and said simply, "Post there. Stagger your stance. Eyes open. Nothing gets through." Her voice was low, steady, cutting through his fear with precision, and he obeyed without argument. Another group hesitated near Harris, waiting for his orders, but Harris himself was still frozen, clipboard clutched in his hand like a shield, his arrogance stripped bare by the sudden realization that the woman he had ridiculed was commanding the moment he couldn't comprehend. Command's voice crackled through the comms again, urgent, demanding a report, and for a heartbeat Harris opened his mouth to answer. But before he could, Zephyr's voice came across the line, firm, clipped, undeniable. South fence compromised, 2 possible entry vectors, calibration restored, reinforcements positioned. Continuing sweep. The silence that followed from headquarters said everything. When the response came, it wasn't addressed to Harris or any of the officers nearby. It was addressed to her. "Zephyr, you're in charge of the line." Those words rippled through the soldiers like a shockwave. In an instant, the hierarchy they had clung to crumbled, an instinct, older than arrogance, told them to follow the one who sounded unshaken, the one who had already steadied the ground beneath their boots. Zephyr didn't pause to savor it. She moved along the perimeter, scanning the fence, testing the locks with quick, precise tugs, her flashlight beam slicing through the dim corners where the cameras still lacked. Every so often she barked a directive. Shift left, keep the gap sealed, eyes up, and soldiers who had laughed at her that morning now scrambled to keep pace, falling in line not because of orders from above, but because the calm in her voice carried more weight than any rank pinned to a collar. Gravel still clung to her boots, dust streaked her uniform, sweat traced her jawline, but she carried herself like someone larger than the moment, someone who had seen the thin line between control and collapse and knew exactly how to hold it steady. The breach attempt itself was subtle, almost invisible, a faint disturbance by the culvert, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, the kind of detail most would dismiss as wind or wildlife, but Zephyr saw it for what it was. She dropped to one knee, fingers brushing over fresh tracks pressed into the damp earth. Too heavy, too deliberate, not the careless scatter of animals. She keyed the radio again, voice steady. Perimeter breach confirmed, southeast culvert. Locking it down. A second later, command repeated her words across every channel, her assessment now the official truth of the base. Soldiers scrambled into new formations under her direction, their earlier bravado silenced, their focus sharpened not by fear, but by the anchor she provided simply by refusing to waver. Lieutenant Harris finally found his voice, barking something about taking over, but his words fell flat against the sound of boots obeying Zephyr instead. He stood there, clipboard trembling slightly in his hand, watching as the unit that had once laughed at her now moved with cohesion around her, their eyes turning to her for cues, their confidence drawn not from his rank, but from her certainty. And in that strange, tense half-hour where the perimeter trembled between order and collapse, Zephyr became the axis around which the base steadied itself. She didn't raise her voice, didn't seek recognition. She simply acted, the way she had always acted, as though every second mattered, as though silence was just another form of preparation. By the time the breach was secured and the last blind spot reinforced, the sun was dipping lower, throwing long shadows across the gravel she had shoveled only hours before. The air was still thick with adrenaline, soldiers murmuring in disbelief at what they had just witnessed, but Zephyr didn't linger in the glow of it. She returned to the barricade, picked up her shovel, and resumed her work as if nothing had happened, her movements steady, deliberate, the dust rising again with each scoop. Behind her, the same cadets who had mocked her now stood straighter, quieter, watching in silence as though trying to reconcile the woman before them with the one they had dismissed. They didn't yet have the words, but in their eyes was something new, something she recognized from battlefields long past. Respect, unspoken but undeniable. And still, she didn't look up, because for her, the moment wasn't about vindication. It was about readiness, always readiness, because she knew the world rarely waited for laughter to die before testing whether you were strong enough to hold the line. The sun had slipped lower in the sky, stretching long shadows over the gravel she had once been mocked for moving, and the air still carried the weight of adrenaline when the perimeter finally settled, the last checks completed, the breach contained, and silence, real silence, returned, but it was a silence different from the one that had hung over her in the morning. This silence wasn't dismissive or mocking. It was heavy with recognition, with the unspoken shift of men and women realizing the ground they had been standing on had changed beneath them. Zephyr leaned on the shovel she had picked up again, boots pressing into the same dust, face streaked with sweat, breathing steady, as if she hadn't just orchestrated the defense of a vulnerable line that could have spiraled into chaos, as if it had been nothing more than another task to be done. The cadets lingered nearby, awkward, restless, their jokes long since evaporated, their arrogance deflated into quiet observation. They watched her movements now the way soldiers once watched commanding officers, measuring their own steps by hers, waiting for cues they didn't dare laugh at anymore. Lieutenant Harris stood a few paces away, clipboard tucked awkwardly under his arm, his posture stiff, jaw tight, the weight of embarrassment written across his face though he tried to mask it with the soldier's stillness. But every now and then his eyes darted toward her, and each time he looked away quickly, as if the shame of underestimating her had been carved too deeply to meet her gaze. Then the sound of boots approached from the opposite side of the barricade, an officer from command, flanked by aides, moving with that clipped efficiency that always preceded a debrief. The younger soldiers instinctively straightened, shoulders snapping back, but the officer's attention went directly to Zephyr, his voice calm, yet deliberate as he said, "Your report." No hesitation, no indulgence in Harris or anyone else. Just straight to the woman still standing with dust on her gloves. Zephyr didn't falter. She laid out the sequence with clinical precision, where the system failed, how the breach had been spotted, which positions had been reinforced, and how the threat had been neutralized before escalation. Her tone was flat, professional, free of pride or self-congratulation, as if it were nothing more than the job she had always done. When she finished, the officer gave a sharp nod and, turning toward the gathered soldiers, announced, "Understand this. What you witnessed today was not luck. It was experience. She saw what you didn't. She moved when you froze. And she held the line that would have collapsed under anyone else." His words hung in the air, cutting through the weight of the moment more cleanly than any reprimand ever could. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances, shame painted across their young faces, realizing they had laughed at the very person who had saved them from failure. But the officer wasn't finished. He turned to Harris, who swallowed hard, his clipboard nearly slipping from his fingers, and asked in a voice sharp enough to cut, "Lieutenant, what exactly were you doing while Specialist Zephyr held your sector together?" Harris stammered something about coordination, about monitoring reports, but the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears, and the officer didn't bother to press further. His silence was enough. He looked back at Zephyr, offered a brief nod that carried more weight than medals often did, and then dismissed the group with the instruction to remember who steadied you when it counted. The soldiers dispersed slowly, their earlier bravado stripped down to quiet reflection, and though no one said it aloud, the hierarchy among them had shifted. Zephyr was no longer the worker with a shovel. She was the anchor they hadn't known they needed until the moment arrived. As the sky deepened into gold and purple, a few of the cadets approached her tentatively, unsure how to bridge the chasm between their mockery and their newfound respect. One of them, the youngest, the same who had begged her for instructions mid-crisis, finally found the courage to speak. "Specialist, thank you. I didn't realize," his voice trailed off, words failing him, but the sincerity was etched in his expression. Zephyr looked at him, eyes steady, and gave the faintest nod before returning to her work, her silence more powerful than any speech could have been. The cadet straightened unconsciously, as if that simple acknowledgement had granted him more honor than any shouted praise. Another stepped forward, muttered an apology under his breath, and though she didn't respond, he lingered for a moment longer before walking away, head bowed in humility. When the camp finally grew quiet, when the bustle of cleanup gave way to the muted hum of generators and the distant calls of night patrol, Zephyr stood alone by the barricade, shovel still in hand, staring at the horizon. Her body ached, her scars pulsed with the memory of old wounds, but her mind was steady, her breathing even. She had lived through worse, carried heavier burdens, but something about this day felt different, not because she had proven them wrong, but because once again she had been reminded of the fine line between perception and reality, between who people think you are and who you truly become when the test comes. She didn't smile, didn't revel in the quiet shift of respect, because she knew tomorrow the world would still doubt, still underestimate, still forget, and she would still be ready, shovel in hand, eyes sharp, listening for the faintest hum that others dismissed. And when the next call came, whether tomorrow, next month, or years from now, she would answer it the same way she always had. Not for recognition, not for vindication, but because readiness had become her life, because the line had to be held, and because she knew, better than anyone else, that silence was never weakness. It was waiting. It was watching. It was strength hidden in plain sight, until the speakers called her name again.